The night that should never exist on one winter night, 5 sacred Ottoman laws were quietly executed inside a locked palace room. A slave girl walked into a wedding no sultan was ever allowed to have. What happened after the doors closed changed the empire more than any war. And by morning, power in the Ottoman world no longer belonged to one man. In the year 1534, inside the silent heart of Topkapi Palace, something happened that was never meant to be written down. No official chronicle recorded it. No court poet dared to describe it. Yet this single night would quietly destroy 3 centuries of sacred tradition and reshape the fate of an empire that stretched from Hungary to Yemen. What the court saw was a wedding. What history tried to hide was a carefully planned revolution carried out without armies, without blood, and without witnesses. For 300 years, the Ottoman dynasty had survived by obeying 5 unbreakable rules. No sultan married a slave. No woman stayed in the palace of government. No concubine bore more than one son. No woman advised on matters of state. And no single mother was ever allowed to grow powerful enough to threaten the balance of the dynasty. These laws were not written in stone, but they were treated as sacred because they protected the empire from civil war, brother killing brother, and mothers turning princes into weapons. Yet on this night, all 5 laws were about to die. The woman who stood at the center of this forbidden moment had once been called Alexandra. She was born in a small village in Rauhatin, the daughter of a poor Orthodox priest. Her life was supposed to be simple, filled with prayers and quiet days. Instead, Tatar raiders burned her world and dragged her into slavery. She passed through the markets of Kaffa like a piece of merchandise, valued for her pale skin and strange red hair, until she was sent to Istanbul as a gift for the imperial harem. There, her old life was erased. She was given a new name, Hurrem, the one who brings joy. She learned languages, music, poetry, and the secret art of surviving in a palace where every smile hid a knife. Most girls in the harem dreamed of one night with the sultan. Hurrem dreamed of something far more dangerous, never being sent away. Suleiman the Magnificent was young, powerful, and already feared across 3 continents. He was a warrior, but also a poet, a man who believed himself the shadow of God on earth. When he noticed Hurrem, he did not see a slave. He saw a mind that challenged him, and a presence that refused to kneel in fear. What began as desire slowly turned into dependence, and dependence quietly turned into trust. Years passed, and one by one, Hurrem gave him children. Each birth broke an ancient rule. Each time she was supposed to be forgotten, she was instead called back. The court began to whisper. The viziers began to worry. The balance of the dynasty began to crack. Then came the decision that should have been impossible. In secret, preparations began for a wedding no one was supposed to witness. A sultan marrying a former slave was not just scandal. It was a direct attack on the foundations of the empire. But by the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already too late. On that night, when the doors finally closed behind them, the Ottoman Empire still believed it had one ruler. By morning, it would belong to 2. And one of them was a woman history tried to erase. The 5 laws that were meant to save an empire. The empire was built on 5 laws, and one woman was about to break them all. Every child she gave birth to was not a blessing, but a political weapon. And behind silk curtains, powerful men began to realize they were losing control. Long before Hurrem's name was ever whispered in the halls of Topkapi, the Ottoman dynasty had learned its cruel lessons through blood. In earlier generations, princes had slaughtered their own brothers, and mothers had turned their sons into rivals. To stop this endless cycle, the sultans created rules that were meant to keep women and ambition away from power. These rules were not mercy, they were survival. The first rule was simple and merciless. 1 concubine, 1 son. After giving birth to a prince, a woman was never again allowed to share the sultan's bed. This ensured that no mother could ever build an army of sons or gather enough influence to challenge the balance of the dynasty. The second rule was just as firm. A sultan could never marry a slave. Marriage was not romance. It was diplomacy. Wives were supposed to come from royal families, not from the slave markets. The third rule kept women away from the heart of power. No woman was allowed to live in the palace of government, where councils met and decisions of war were made. The fourth rule fixed every woman's rank forever. A concubine could never become a queen. The fifth rule was the most important of all. Women were never to speak in matters of state. For nearly 3 centuries, these laws had worked. The empire grew. The throne remained strong. And the harem stayed a silent world, beautiful and dangerous, but politically invisible. Then Hurrem began to change everything, not with open rebellion, but with patience. When she gave birth to her first son, Mehmed, everyone assumed her fate was sealed. She would be honored, moved aside, and forgotten. But she was not. She was called again, and again. With every new child, the old order weakened. Merima, Selim, Bayezid, Sehengir. Each birth was more than a family event. It was a quiet earthquake inside the palace walls. The court could no longer pretend this was normal. Other mothers in the harem watched in fear. The officials watched in silence. They all understood what this meant. Hurrem was no longer just a favorite. She was becoming a force. Even more dangerous than her children was her place in the Sultan's mind. Suleiman began to speak with her about his worries, his campaigns, his doubts. She listened, she remembered. And when she spoke, she did so carefully, never like a ruler, always like someone who only wanted to help. But slowly, decisions began to follow her words. Foreign ambassadors noticed it before many Ottomans dared to admit it. They wrote home that the Sultan was no longer alone in his thoughts, that a red-haired woman behind the curtains seemed to know everything. The rules were still written. The traditions were still recited. But in reality, they were already broken. And when laws lose their power in silence, something far more dangerous takes their place. The empire was no longer protected by its old walls. It was waiting for the moment they would finally collapse. The girl who learned how to rule in silence, she was trained to obey, but she learned how to control. Every lesson in the harem was turning her into something far more dangerous than a concubine. And while the empire watched the Sultan, no one noticed who was truly changing him. The imperial harem was not a place of comfort. It was a school of survival. Behind its beautiful walls, hundreds of women lived under strict rules, watched by guards, eunuchs, and older women who had learned long ago that one mistake could mean exile or death. For most girls, the harem was the end of all dreams. For Hurrem, it became a classroom. From the first day, she understood something important. Beauty could open doors, but only the mind could keep them open. She listened more than she spoke. She watched how favors were given and how they were taken away. She learned which servants talked too much, which officials were afraid, and which women in the palace were already losing influence. Slowly, she began to understand that power in the Ottoman world did not always sit on a throne. Often, it hid behind curtains. Her education was not only about music and poetry. She learned how to read people. She learned when to cry, when to laugh, and when to stay silent. Most importantly, she learned how to make others feel understood. This was her greatest weapon. When she spoke to Suleiman, she did not speak like a slave asking for mercy. She spoke like someone who shared his burdens. The Sultan was surrounded by men who always told him what he should do. Hurrem was different. She asked him what he felt. In long private evenings, she listened to his doubts about war, about his sons, about the heavy weight of ruling 3 continents. She never argued directly. She only placed thoughts in his mind and let him believe they were his own. Over time, he began to trust her more than anyone else. This was something no woman before her had achieved. The harem noticed the change. The servants noticed it. Even the guards noticed that Hurrem's rooms were visited more often than any other. But the most worried man in the palace was Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha. He had been Suleiman's friend since childhood. He had helped him build his empire. And now he felt something slipping away. Ibrahim saw how the Sultan's decisions were slowly changing. He saw how Hurrem's words were followed by actions. He warned Suleiman carefully, without accusation, but the warnings only created distance between them. The more he spoke against her, the more Suleiman defended her. Hurrem also understood something else. As long as the Sultan's mother, Hafsa Sultan, was alive, there were limits to her power. Hafsa controlled the harem and protected the old traditions. She did not trust the red-haired girl, and she had the authority to stop her. But time, patience, and silence are powerful tools. When Hafsa Sultan died, the palace said it was illness. But whispers moved through the corridors like cold wind. Some spoke of slow poison. Some spoke of careful hands. Nothing was ever proven. Nothing was ever written. What mattered was simple. The last great barrier was gone. Now, between Hurrem and absolute influence, only one man remained. And she was already standing inside his mind. What really happened behind the locked doors, the wedding the world remembers, was not the real ceremony. Behind locked doors, a far more dangerous agreement was made. And by dawn, the Ottoman throne no longer belonged to one voice. The official story was simple. Sultan Suleiman married Hurrem, and the court celebrated with gifts, feasts, and prayers. To the outside world, it looked like a strange but joyful event. Yet inside Topkapi Palace, everyone understood that something far more serious had just taken place. This was not just a marriage. It was the breaking of a system that had protected the empire for centuries. No one had seen a sultan marry a former slave since the early days of the dynasty. There were no old rules for how this should be done, because it was never supposed to happen. The ceremony was kept small. No great foreign guests were invited. No loud celebrations were allowed. Even many officials learned about it only after it was already over. But the real event did not happen in the public halls. It happened later, in the private chambers, where only a few trusted servants and guards were allowed to stand nearby. There, something unusual took place. Hurrem was not treated like a normal wife. She was not reminded of obedience or silence. Instead, she was given a place beside the Sultan that no woman had held before. The sources that survive today do not describe the words that were spoken, but they describe the result. From that night onward, Hurrem was no longer just a member of the harem. She became a partner in rule. Soon after the wedding, changes began to appear. Hurrem was allowed to remain inside Topkapi, close to the seat of government. This alone was a violation of ancient custom. Before her, mothers of princes were always sent away to distant provinces. She was not. She stayed at the center of power. Then came the letters. For the first time in Ottoman history, a sultan's wife began to write directly to foreign rulers. Her letters to the King of Poland and other leaders still exist today. They were polite, careful, and intelligent. But their meaning was clear. The empire now spoke with two voices. Inside the palace, the atmosphere changed. Officials began to ask themselves a dangerous question. Were they serving only the Sultan, or were they also serving his wife? The most uneasy man of all was Ibrahim Pasha. He could feel his influence shrinking. He had once been the second most powerful man in the empire. Now, he was slowly becoming a guest in decisions he used to control. Hurrem did not attack him openly. She did something far more effective. She allowed him to make mistakes. She allowed suspicion to grow. She allowed the Sultan to begin doubting the man he had once trusted more than anyone. The wedding night did not end with music and candles. It ended with a silent shift of power. From that night on, the Ottoman Empire was no longer ruled only from the throne. It was also ruled from behind a curtain. And not everyone would survive this new order. The invisible war begins. No war was declared, yet enemies began to disappear. No sword was raised, yet blood quietly changed the future of the throne. And in the shadows, a mother began choosing which sons would live. After the wedding, the palace no longer felt like the same place. Nothing looked different to visitors, but inside, fear had begun to move like a slow poison. Decisions were no longer simple. Every appointment, every exile, every promotion carried hidden meaning. The empire was still expanding, but at its heart, a silent war had begun. The first victim of this new age was trust. Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha had once been Suleiman's closest friend. He had slept in the same room as him when they were young. He had helped build the empire's victories. But now, every word he spoke was weighed, and every action was watched. Hurrem never accused him directly. She only reminded the Sultan of how much power one man held, and how dangerous ambition could become. Slowly, Suleiman began to see his old friend through different eyes. In 1536, Ibrahim Pasha was invited to dinner at the palace. By morning, he was dead. Officially, it was the Sultan's decision. Unofficially, everyone understood that a new force had finally removed its greatest obstacle. The empire lost its most powerful minister in one night, and no one dared to ask why. But this was only the beginning. The more terrifying struggle was not between ministers. It was between mothers and sons. Ottoman tradition was cruel. All princes were potential rivals. When one became sultan, the others often died to prevent civil war. Hurrem knew this better than anyone. She had many sons, and Suleiman already had another, Prince Mustafa, the son of Mahid Evran, loved by the army and respected by the people. Mustafa was everything a future sultan should be: brave, generous, and popular, and that made him dangerous. Whispers began to reach Suleiman. Stories of secret plans, stories of rebellion, stories of letters that no one could ever fully prove. Some may have been lies, some may have been half-truths, but doubt is more powerful than certainty. In 1553, during a military campaign, Suleiman ordered Mustafa to be executed. The prince walked into his father's tent and never walked out. Soldiers cried. The army was shocked. But the order was law. One by one, the path to the throne was being cleared. Hurrem did not live to see the final outcome of this struggle, but the war she began continued after her death. Her sons fought each other. Brothers turned into enemies. The palace became a place where love and fear could not be separated. This was the true price of breaking the old laws. The empire had gained a new kind of power, but it had also opened a door that could never again be closed. And behind that door waited a future built not only on crowns, but on graves. The birth of the Sultanate of Women. What began as one forbidden wedding became a century of shadow rule. Sultans sat on the throne, but decisions were made behind curtains, and history chose to remember the empire, while forgetting who truly shaped it. Hurrem Sultan did not live long enough to see the full world she had created, but the path she opened never closed again. When she died in 1558, the palace mourned her in silence, and the empire moved on as if nothing had changed. But in truth, everything had changed forever. Before her, women were meant to be invisible. After her, they would never be again. Suleiman the Magnificent ruled until his death, and history remembers him as one of the greatest emperors who ever lived. His conquests, his laws, and his buildings still shape the memory of the Ottoman Empire. Yet behind those achievements stood a transformation no battlefield could ever show. He was the last sultan who ruled entirely alone. After him came an age that historians would later call the Sultanate of Women. Mothers, wives, and grandmothers of sultans began to control the palace from behind walls and curtains. They arranged marriages, decided alliances, removed ministers, and sometimes even chose which prince would live long enough to wear the crown. The throne still belonged to men, But the future was often written by women whose names were rarely spoken in public. Some of them ruled wisely, some ruled cruelly. All of them ruled in shadows. The system Hurrem had broken was never repaired. The old laws, once meant to protect the dynasty, were now only memories. Princes grew up in fear. Brothers learned to see each other as enemies. Love inside the palace became dangerous, and trust became rare. The empire did not collapse because of this, but it was never the same again. Wars were still fought, cities were still conquered, but inside the palace, something had shifted forever. Power was no longer only about armies and titles. It was about access, influence, and the quiet control of a ruler's mind. Hurrem had proven that an empire could be changed without leading a single army. She had arrived as a slave. She had died as one of the most powerful women in history. And yet, for centuries, her true role was hidden behind polite words and careful silence. Today, when we look back at the Ottoman Golden Age, we see great sultans, great victories, and great monuments. But we rarely ask the most uncomfortable question of all. Who was really ruling? The story of Hurrem Sultan is not just about one woman. It is about how power truly works. Not always in public, not always with crowns. Sometimes behind a locked door on a single night that changes everything.